All right, what is up, everybody, and welcome to our second author reading here on day 5 of TBRCon 2023. And I'm pleased today to be joined by Adrian.
Hello.
My shaved Adrian. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
If anyone doesn't understand that reference, go watch the space opera panel we did yesterday. But it's good to see you again, and I'm very excited today because you're going to be reading from your new fantasy novel, The City of Last Chances. So can you tell me a little bit about beautiful, beautiful cover? He's got it there. I'll throw it up on the screen as well because it is gorgeous. Look at that. Can you tell everyone a little bit about yourself if they don't know who is Adrian Tchaikovsky?
So I am a British fantasy and science fiction writer. I'm probably best known at the moment for my science fiction, especially Children of Time, but I started off with a fantasy writer, and as of quite recently, they've let me get back into the fantasy game with this book, which I feel is one of my best. I'm tremendously excited about, and I hope people like it.
Yeah, I'm very, very excited for it. And just to give people a little bit of a sense of what City of Last Chances is about, can you tell them a bit of a synopsis?
Yeah, so it's set in a sort of fantasy industrial city. It's high magic, so the factories are powered by demons and all that sort of thing. The city is occupied by an outside power. There is a revolution brewing, and the various cast of characters in the city, who are generally fairly ordinary people, are desperately trying not to be involved in any of the normal fantasy book shenanigans because that will get you killed.
I love it. And for you, you mentioned that your publisher kind of let you back into the fantasy ropes. How do you feel after all this time getting back into fantasy? Because that was what you originally started out with.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's something I've missed and something I've kind of been pushing for a while. I mean, I love writing sci-fi, but writing fantasy is its own thing, and I've definitely missed the complete freedom of creation you get when you're working in an entirely secondary world.
Yeah, I can imagine. And you got a couple books coming out this year, I think, actually. So you got City of Last Chances came out in the UK in December. It'll be out in May here in North America. But then you've also got Children of Memory. That's the third and final book in the Children of Time series.
It's the third book. It may not be the final book. It depends whether another idea turns up. They build it as the final one, but that doesn't come from me. So yes, I think that is just out in the US now.
I believe January 31st is the release date.
Yeah. Oh, right. You know what? Well, actually, I was about to say they don't tell me anything, but possibly I just don't listen. But
and then you've got book 3 in the final architecture series coming out in very beginning of May. That's Lords of Uncreation. So you want to tell people a little bit about that series as well?
Yep, that's my big space opera series, given that we were talking about space operas yesterday. It's a universe where there is the enormous moon-sized thing called Architects, and they sculpt planets into avant-garde art structures. They did it to Earth. They did it to a lot of other human planets. Then, for mysterious reasons, they went away, and now they are back. And the main character is a character called Idris. He's an intermediary. He was trained to make contact with the architects, and he's been trying not to have anything to do with the war or politics or all of the various things that people might want him to do. And then he ends up right in the middle of the architect's return.
Wonderful. And so, yeah, we got those big releases coming out this year, but today Adrian will be reading from City of Last Chances. Do you want to tell everyone a little bit about the section that you've chosen to read and why you chose that particular section?
Well, this is actually the very first bit of the book, so it doesn't need a great deal of introduction. It's there, unlike a lot of my books, they're big books, they have big sections, they don't necessarily have a nice little readable bit. Because this book is a mosaic of lots of different characters' points of view, it has a lot of fun reading pieces, but this is one of the most fun bits just because it throws you right into the middle of the weirdness of the setting.
Fantastic. All right, and just to remind everyone, there's a little Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, you can toss them out now or wait till later. But Adrian, I will let you take it away with your reading.
Thank you. That morning, God was complaining again. Yasnik lay crunched up in bed, knees almost to his chin and his feet twined together, trying to tell, from the way the light filtered in through the filthy window, whether the frost was just on the outside or on the inside again. He could have put a hand out to touch the panes and check. He could have put a foot out and kicked at God, or the far wall. It was, he decided, a blessing. The small room held his heat longer. If he'd been able to afford anything larger, then he'd have needed a hearth and to buy wood or coal or magical tablethi to heat the place. "It's cold," God said. "It's so cold." The divine presence was curled up on his shelf like an emaciated cat, at about the same size. He'd shrunk since the night before, and perhaps that, too, was a blessing. Sometimes Yasnik could do with a little less God in his life, and here he was this morning, and God was smaller by at least a quarter. He gave thanks, his knee-jerk reaction ingrained from long years of good upbringing from Kosher, the previous priest of God. Back when Elmar had been a more tolerant place, and old Kosher and Yasnik and God had lived in 3 rooms above a tanner's and had meat at least once a 12-day. Not a 12-day, he reminded himself. The School of Correct Exchange was levying fines and making arrests for people using the old calendar, he'd heard. He had to start thinking in terms of a 7-day week, except then he couldn't look back on the way things had been and quantify the time properly. How often had they had meat back when he'd been a boy learning at Kosher's knee? What was 7 into 12 or 12 into 7 or however it might work? His mathematics weren't good enough to work it out, and so, obscurely, it felt as though a swathe of his memories was locked away by the new ordinances. And also he'd just given thanks to God that he had less God in his life, and God, the recipient of those thanks, was right there and staring at him accusingly. "I need a blanket," said God. "It's only the beginning of winter, and it's so cold." God looked all skin and bones. He wore rags, and it was only a season since Yasnik had sacrificed a good shirt to God. But the diminished state of the faith, meaning Yasnik, tended to mean anything God got his hands on didn't last. A blanket would go the same way. "I only have one blanket," Yasnik told God. "Get another one." God stared at his soul priest from his place on the shelf up by the low ceiling. His spidery hands were gripping the edge, his nose and wisps of beard projecting over them. His skin was wrinkled and greyish, hollowed until the shape of his bones could be seen quite clearly. "In the old days, I had robes of fur and velvet, and my acolytes burned sandalwood." Yes, I know." Yasnik cut God off. "I only have this blanket." He lifted the threadbare covering and regretted it instantly, the chill of the morning taking up residence in a bed with room only for one. "I suppose I'm getting up now," he added pettily. "Please," said God. Yasnik stopped halfway through forcing numb feet into his overtrousers. God looked in a bad way, he had to admit. It was easy just to think that God was being selfish. God had, after all, been very used to people doing what he said and giving him all good things back in the day. Back in the day long before Yasnik, last priest of God, had come along. Their religion had been dying for over a century, ever since they'd raised the big Mahanic temple. And yes, Mahanism had actively spoken out against other religions, but more, they just expanded to fill all the available faith. People went where the social capital was, and now, under the occupation, there really were people purging religions, making arrests for incorrect speech. Just as well it's just me and God, Yasnik thought. Easier to go unnoticed. "Ask the woman," God said. "Ask her for another blanket. I'm cold." "Mother Am will not give us another blanket," Yasnik said. In fact, their landlady would more likely want to ask about last week's rent. And that was another thing, of course. Since the occupation, everything had to be paid sooner because of the weeks, and he couldn't quite make the maths work, but it seemed that he was paying more each day of the 7 than he had each day of the 12, and it wasn't as though being the sole surviving holy man of God actually brought in much. There were few perks, and there was no regular take-home wage, and under the occupation, begging meant risking arrest for incorrect exchange. "I'll see what I can do." Clothes on, he shambled out of the room and went down for tea. One thing Mother Yame did provide her boarders with a constantly churning samovar by the fire, and both fire and tea were just about enough to set up Yasnik for a day's scrounging. God hadn't been with him on the stairs, but was sitting beside the samovar down in the common room. Yasnik took down a cup from its hook and filled it with dark green steaming liquid. He wanted to avoid Mother Yame's notice as he jostled elbows with his fellow boarders to get space at the single table. God was there, though. God was hunched cross-legged on the tin plate Yasnik's neighbour had eaten porridge off. Ask her, God insisted. I won't do it, murmured Yasnik. His neighbour, the big man named Ruslav, who never seemed to have a job but always seemed to have money, stared at him. He couldn't see God sitting in the remains of his porridge. He probably thought Yasnik wanted to lick his plate clean. Jealously, he pulled it closer to himself, making God scrabble for balance. Yasnik winced, aware that everyone was looking at him now, even the student girl who turned up 2 weeks ago and who he dreaded talking to. She was very clever. In Gown Hall, people loved to argue about metaphysics. He was afraid he'd listen to her tortuous logic too much and then look around for God, only God wouldn't be there anymore. And he was afraid of what he might feel if that was the case. Ask, God insisted peevishly. I command it. Mother, Yasnik said, I don't suppose I could beg another blanket from you? Loud enough to carry to the old woman, aware that his words were expanding to fill the room, feeling the students' judging eyes on him, feeling ashamed. And it wasn't even a useful shame, the sort that earned you credit with God, or, in this case, got you a blanket, because Mother Yame was already shaking her head, and if there were a little more money, there might be another blanket, and likely that would mean someone at the table who had a little less money would be missing a blanket, because it was a closed blanket economy here at Mother Yame's boarding house. And if it had just been Yasnik, he would have accepted the lack of a blanket and known that he was making someone else's life better and tried to warm himself with that. But it was God, and God was old and petty and selfish, but God was also cold. And Yasnik had given himself into God's service, and so he begged Mother Yame, with the whole table listening archly to every word, with Ruslav, who probably had 2 blankets, or even 3, snickering in his ear. God was cold, and God didn't have anybody else, and it was all for nothing, because there wasn't another blanket to be had, not with that money he didn't possess. Thank you.
Excellent reading. Your voice work is fantastic, man.
I mean, if people liked it, I have done a few of my novellas as audiobooks. So there are a handful out there, and I'm hopefully doing some more in the near future.
Brilliant. Yeah, I really loved it. And closed blanket economy is a great line. Oh, man. All right. Well, everyone who's watching on YouTube, you can throw some questions in the live chat. We've got a few already. Speaking of great lines, Saren Roberts says, great first line. Did it come to you in a flash of inspiration, or did you have to cultivate it?
I think that came fairly spontaneously. The writing process for this book is different to my normal. Normally, I plan out absolutely every damn thing from the start to the finish. With this book, I had the world and I had the characters. And then I kind of just let them get on with it because I wanted to write about their lives. I didn't want to write about some particular great thrust of a plot or a thing happening. I knew there was the revolution brewing, and I just wanted to write about these, like I say, relatively normal people just ducking and covering as the whole city goes on fire around them.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of that, Vignesh is asking, what are your influences for this book? So what are some of the things that influence this revolution and the world and all that?
So it's definitely a fantasy Les Mis, and I mean more the Victor Hugo book than the musical, particularly because it's a book I absolutely love. It has also got a great big slice of Casablanca in there because in the same way as people go to Casablanca because they want out by boat, the city of Elmar, where Yasnik lives, has a magical grove in it where at the right time you can get out to other worlds as long as you have the relevant sort of magical MacGuffin that lets you get past the monsters and things that live in the wood. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the book is to do with people trying to get out and to do with trying to get hold of these things. And there's a whole big plot about there's one of these things out there and nobody knows quite who ended up with it after a bit of a scuffle. Which was fun to write because I didn't know who had it either. And I had to write from the point of view of every possible person who had it without giving away whether they did or didn't have it, which was a really bizarre exercise. So it's a bit of a Maltese Falcon in that as well. Mm-hmm. But it's also 1848. It's a very underknown piece of history, but there were a wave of almost revolutions that swept pretty much every major state in Europe. everywhere except Russia, who was going to have one later, and England, who had kind of already had one.
Yeah.
United Kingdom rather. And we very nearly had a complete overthrow of most or all of the European powers, and that would have been absolutely amazing. And so just looking at that, that's kind of the time period that I'm thinking of for the social and the magical equivalents of technological innovation. And there's a lot I listened a lot to the Revolutions podcast by Mike Duncan,
so good.
Yeah, I hugely recommend to anyone who has any kind of historical interest. And that was very much an enormous influence on me writing this book.
Yeah, I highly recommend that podcast to anyone out there as well, because he basically just goes through history and tracks different revolutions and essentially the history of revolutions across Europe, across the Caribbean and South America and different places. It's really fascinating. Zoe is asking, is City of Last Chances a standalone, or do you have potential ideas for something more?
Well, that is hot news, as they say. So it was written as a standalone. It has no kind of particular cliffhanger at the end. It's definitely a fully complete story. However, I really loved writing it, and Head of Zeus obviously liked it as well, because even before it came out, they had said, yes, go ahead, we will do another one. So I am currently about a third of the way through a second book in this setting, which is hopefully going to be capable of being read standalone. So it'll have some links to the first one, but not ones that require you to have read it, which seems to be the model that a lot of publishers are looking at for kind of multi-book settings at the moment.
Yeah, I spoke with Gareth Powell, a friend of Adrian, who is doing a series with Titan, but each starting with Stars and Bones, and each of those is a standalone as well, but set in the same universe. So I think, yeah, that's a bit of a trend, because series don't have the market potential that publishers probably wish they could give to authors. Evie's asking, did you write one point of view at a time, or almost as much as they are laid out in the novel? How did you kind of piece all that together?
I did what I normally do, which is I wrote it in the order it turns up to the reader, because I find if you don't do that, then there's an enormous amount of continuity work you've got to go back and do, because it's very, very important in what order the reader is encountering the characters and encountering the concepts and events and so forth, so that you can know what's in the reader's head at any given time from previous chapters. I think I know there are writers who do the individual strands, and I've done it a bit where I've got like a past and a present strand, like in Children of Ruin.
Yep.
So I wrote the earlier strand first, so I knew the physical setup for what people were going to discover in the present day strand. But usually it'll be even with this one, where the writing has been considerably more of a Wild West sort of show. It's in the order it's on the page.
Oh, fantastic. And Evie also asks, without giving anything away, the open-ended ending of the book, was that intentional, or did you have any other endings in mind that potentially didn't make the cut? Or
well, my normal practice is, when I say I plan everything, so say with Children of Time or something like that, the one thing I don't plan is the ending of the book.
Right.
And I usually trust that the book will have the trajectory and momentum to show me where it needs to go at the end. And with this one, of course, I had far less planned, and I had no idea how it was going to end, or even if it was going to end, or it would still be going strong in like 4,000 pages. How it all turns out, what happens with the revolution, who lives, who dies, or how all of these strands actually were to come together was a complete mystery to me. I'm just very glad that they did, but I feel like I can claim very little credit for it.
It's just the muse doing its usual thing. Awesome. And Vignesh also asks, what is your next book after Lords of Uncreation? Can you say anything about it?
So let me see. Lords of Uncreation. I'm in an odd position because I'm working with multiple publishers. So the second book, the book that comes after City of Last Chances, may well be out right at the end of this year, depending on how quickly I can write it and how quickly they can get it onto the shelves. I know that is the plan. It may not survive contact with the enemy, so to speak. The next book, the next kind of big sci-fi from Pam Macmillan, is currently going under a working title of Alien Clay. It's a book that is simultaneously about kind of authoritarian regimes and alien ecosystems, and the bad thing to happen when you have both of those in one book. It's a very much a big alien ecosystem, with me looking at a very weird sort of alien biological setup, which is very, very different to an Earth setup.
Oh, I love that though, because that's very fitting for you in terms of things that I've seen as sort of continuing studies of interest in your work. Aliens and biology and zoology being one of them, but also systems and institutions and politics and history and how those things kind of intertwine together.
Yeah, it's with the alien stuff. I'm generally more interested in the wider ecology than here is an individual alien creature. I mean, obviously there are plenty of alien creatures. It has alien monsters up the wazoo, but the important and interesting thing in the book is how these things interact with each other, which is in a very non-Earth like way. In the same way as I think City of Last Chance is very much built on the strength of its individual characters, but the book is about the city and the relationships between the various factions and groups in the city. And again, so it is a social ecosystem.
Yeah, and touching on those characters a little bit in City of Last Chances, who is your favorite character to write? A question in the chat.
So there are far too many options, to be honest, and the answer will probably change. There's an innkeeper called Langris who tends the inn at the edge of this magical wood, and there is a pawnbroker called Blackmane, and they are both older characters. They have known each other a long time, and the relationship between them is almost the character I enjoyed writing, because it's very seldom addressed directly. It comes out, you kind of feel around the edges of it by the way that they interact. You can just tell they've had all of this stuff go on, and they've been friends and they've been enemies, and they have just rubbed along in the same city for decades. There's also a character called Helgrim who has basically come to the city from an entirely different book, or at least an entirely different world. He came out of the wood. He does not in any way belong in this book, and therefore does a lot of things that no one else in the book can do. And he is looking for his wife, and he's a bit of this. He's basically like a lost soldier character who does not know how to function or fit in with any of the other characters, and has found this very weird position basically as a chucker outer for Langris. And you get bits occasionally from inside his head, and you get a glimpse into the world he came from, which is just utterly mad and quite horrible.
Brilliant. I love it. And Tom asks on Twitter, do you plan on revisiting Elmar in the future?
Well, so like I say, there is another book in this setting in the works. It's probably not going to be in Elmar. It will involve at least some of the characters from the book. It will certainly involve some of the institutions in the book, like the occupying nation, the Palestine, who are the main bad guys. They are certainly going to be a major part in the next book as well. And if hopefully the books will do well enough that they'll let me write a few more, because I'd quite like to kind of gad about in the world and then possibly come back to Elmar for kind of a grand flourish at the end of it. But we'll see how it goes. And the idea is each one will hopefully be pick-upable on its own. But we'll see how I do with that.
Right on. Because Evie was saying that though the city itself feels like a character, so Elmar itself is a bit of its own character.
Yeah, I think that's very much it. Is the big overarching it is the monster, and it is the hero, and it is the victim. It's I think more than anything else I've read, the location is just the driving force of the book, the protagonist. Really
fantastic. And Fit to Be Read, don't worry. They said they're asking about the final architecture series, saying they just realized the title of the live stream. Sorry for the off-topic question. No, Adrian's work is Adrian's work. Speaking of futures in series, would you return to the final architecture series or that universe in some capacity beyond book 3?
I mean, never say never. The book 3 does wrap everything up nicely, but I've never written anything I can't go back to. Basically, it's kind of a very ingrained habit to. And also, I feel, occasionally I've written a novella where basically that novella is very, very done. There's nothing, to go back to that setting would just be, you might as well do something completely separate. There's no obvious point in revisiting it because the novella was to tell that one story. But usually if I'm making a setting, a novel length project, the point of the setting is that it lives beyond the individual events. It's not the matter that at the end of it everything is wrapped up and they all live happily ever after. It's just that, okay, we've got to the end of that, but there are very clearly like 7 other crises that are going to be happening at some point in the near future, any one of which could be its own book, which is obviously what I'm doing with the one I'm currently writing. So with the Architects, there is certainly material for me to go and write more books in that setting should the mood take me. But at the same time, at the end of Lords of Uncreation, it is very the plot line that started with Shards of Earth is hopefully very satisfactorily concluded.
I agree. This is just a comment, but I like it. Fit to Be Read says the relationship between Idris and the angel punching you in the face is so captivating, and I agree. I really love that relationship. Adrian, we will wrap things up there, but thank you so much for taking the time, for doing your reading from City of Last Chances, from answering all these questions. I'll show off your books one more time for anybody out there. So City of Last Chances is out now in the UK. It'll be out in May 2nd in North America. And then we've got Children of Memory, which will be out on January 31st. So just coming up next week here. And then Lords of Uncreation, I believe, is coming out the same day as City of Last Chances. So you got a busy few months. But that's the Final Architecture's final book. And I highly recommend you all check out Adrian's work because it is excellent. If you like fantasy, if you like sci-fi, if you like space opera, if you like hard SF, he's got everything for you. And thank you to all of you for hanging out with us and asking some great questions. Adrian, thank you again. If you could let people know where they can find you on social media.
Yep, I'm Apt Shadow on Twitter and Mastodon. But for actual any sort of hard news and stuff, AdrianTchaikovsky.com is my website.
Fantastic. And speaking of Apt Shadow, if you like fantasy, go check out the Shadow of the App series.
Thank you.
Some of Adrian's older work, but really, really good. And thank you again and enjoy the rest of TBRCon 2023 Day 5, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the convention. And Adrian, we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks very much.